The reference therefore go to Kant, Hegel, and so many other philosophers he referred in the book and engaged in a very substantive way. So, for example, Kant and Rousseau, the way they engage with the idea of dignity and the idea of individual liberty, basically how Kant learned from Rousseau in the Enlightenment project, and how the idea of categorical imperative inaugurated the communicative theory, and that was taken by Habermas. Uh, uh, According to Habermas, therefore, a life world is reproduced through the exchange of communicative act between members and the cultural communities. So there is a deeper link between communication and recognition in a Hegelian sense. Uh, in that, there is, Hegel always believed in the idea of dialectics and how the dialectics are having internal and the external, self in relation to other and in relation to the self itself. So in which the language play a important role of mediating this, this role. So, so therefore the concept of recognition come into play in that. So in Kant, individual is primary, as we all know, and individual become an agency to, express oneself, and that become the normative in the modern institution. That is very, very, one of the very powerful articulation in the modern society, or in the liberal democracy, one would say. However, there is also a critique from Hegel saying that this is very, very arbitrary. And in the present time, what we see so much, Hegelian interpretation of idea of recognition. However, the leading philosopher excel on it somewhere, mix Hegel and Kant, but Hegel, come forth so frequently. I'll come to that part in a minute. So therefore, Chris, moving from this, claim, the Kantian claim, one would say, the individual agent, and going to the social, and social for him come through the nature and naturalizing, behavior and so on. So. So the question, therefore, one look at here is that how Chris actually argues that how can as individual have capacity to build our own sense of self-worth both collectively and individually. We need to move away from purely casual understanding of our agency, and that is the critique to the individualist model. Reference goes back to Kant. Further, he believes that, Chris believes that human beings are part of natural order as well as part of the animal species, bound by a physiological and the physical laws. Therefore, one need to understand the naturalistic location also, see our normative identity. Hence, to capture our real social status, one need to review our naturalistic lives, that is act of social recognition, which human being engage in daily basis. This is his main claim in the book. So now I have some question to go, but before that I would like to begin with this in the very second chapter, the first chapter, where he is situating the idea called political naturalism. And the very first paragraph where he, writes very, very general, idea about the way human being lives. what kind of negotiation, interaction, and and the association with everyone in the society, right? And he basically calls it calls it it is a natural process. It is a very natural instinct of human being to live with everyone. So therefore we see association, interaction, and family, colleague, professional, and so on and so forth. So the point here that I would like to make, that how the idea of the nature therefore come into play. Is it something that again we are it is something that he is thinking that nature is something that it is available to everyone, and therefore man is a natural being. Again, we can go back to Aristotle and others. So, but at the same time, the nature and social, the natural and the social, how one can really distinguish that, in the sense that who would actually have the agency in the nature, in a natural way to express oneself, because the society is not something that the way Chris is trying to theorize, philosophize, because society also always guided by some norm, and not necessarily this norm come from the natural natural way, right? So therefore one need to look at this point as well. So therefore so therefore, how this claim is, is a claim that would, help us to, understand the naturalizing the social and political norms, because the moment we, begin to think about the very original kind of, position, probably not roles in that case, our roles also, come into play, in the sense that, everyone, need to forget the past. So therefore, they would begin with, very blanket, very, empty plate. So point here is this: if you take, think about this is something called very natural, I think. I think we miss about the existing social kind of thing. So that is one point to begin. So I am skipping to other parts. Definitely when I write, I will write in a very substantive way. So very unfortunate that it is. I didn't get any reference in the Indian context or any reference to India, because he is an Indian philosopher, right? And this book is all about the Western and the European, engagement. So, and when I work in the area of recognition, I could see so much reference to, India, and definitely I would, say about, B.R. Ambedkar for that matter, and the literature that you refer, so much, resemblance that one can, get from, Ambedkar, whether it is idea of antagonistic, the what is the thinker name? Yes, Santhal move, and then Ambedkar calls contradiction in Indian society. So only one reference that come here when you started thinking about critiquing the colonialism, right? Post-colonial society. So even the post-colonial society, you cited Kabiraj and others. The way that the post-colonial scholarship in India and elsewhere available, it is basically to critique the colonial apparatus, or colonial the way the colonialism impact in a society like India and elsewhere, and they started theorizing that. But again, the question would definitely come for us to understand that, is it something that one would understand society through colonial interpretation of of society, polity, and nation, and so on? one need to also look at the pre-colonial, society. Even in the colonial society, how, the idea of political and social really works. That is a question, and therefore your critique to post-colonialism through, the argument that you develop with the, the naturalizing social political norm, I would think that you need to look at the other critique of, post-colonialism, right? Like, when we read about post-colonial critique, Gandhi would actually come into figure. Gandhi would be one figure in that, critique. But at the same time, is it something that we live only through the post-colonial kind of, impact in post-colonial kind of, uh, uh, the political? I don't think so. It is only the, real, case. So therefore, only critiquing post-colonialism and how post-colonialism, uh, uh, help us to even imagine the idea of nation and so on. So therefore, there is so much to say when it comes to the idea of nation, post-colonialism, and so on, because identity really play an important role here. So without really discussing the question of identity and, pitching the argument of post-colonial critique, or, I think one need to, look at that as well. So even I thought your engagement with the literature and the way you develop, I could see so much, Hegelian interpretation. Honneth and others actually come into play, but Hegel actually is there everywhere. Where did you, get away from the, Kantian, interpretation of, individual agent? Because I would say that when somebody would try to philosophize the naturalizing political norm, social norm, I think individual play an important role here, and individual is something to do with the coming from the natural kind of, rights. It is not that something that, the social give the right individual to, express themselves. It is something that, it is kind of a very natural kind of an interpretation. I don't like to, cite here Locke and others, John Locke. John Locke would be, very libertarian kind of interpretation. But again, I would really like to hold on to this idea of, individual and themselves, the Kantian self, the Kantian interpretation, because there only individual get a, chance to express themselves. It is not the social that would give you a chance to express. So therefore, how the idea of recognition is going to play there, because recognition always, come through the social, situatedness of an individual, and the individual in that sense very much part of the culture and society and so on. And that, individual, recognition not necessarily, take us to think about respect and dignity, because the social already given there, and through that the person is recognized. And probably take example of black in America, right? It is a very social question, and the black are always, stigmatized, correct? And so therefore, in that context, the only the construction of, individual, the construction of, individual agency would play an important role of questioning the authority, social authority, and also, express oneself. So therefore, for example, to, understand towards the end, you wrote a very, very, interesting paragraph, this chapter called Socio-Cultural Norms in the Public Places. So I would like to read this and, put my point and end, right? So he writes, we live thus embedded in our environment because our intentional goals are fulfilled only through certain standards that are external and given to us through social setting that exists around us. What are social being? And we are social being because our intentionality is not only something that is merely personal, but is collective. I say collective intentionality because the acquisition of the practical goals we project onto our lives is historically determined. Historical movement of our lives is collection of all ritual, tradition, culture, which have been transmitted throughout our community's history. So what I would say, this is, Taylor actually also come into play here, Charles Taylor. So Charles Taylor always think through tradition, ritual, and so on, and these are, somewhere constitute the idea of good. I would read this paragraph, this, argument as something very, very communitarian. However, you may not, agree on this, but this actually takes us to think about the idea of community itself. And community is a collection. It is a collective, living. It is not something that individualistic living. So point here is that without, specifying the nature of community, without specifying the nature of, rituals, the nature of the tradition, culture, and so on, so how one would only think in a very abstract term of thinking about, naturalizing the recognition. Because the naturalizing recognition through the association, through the interaction, through the tradition, ritual, culture, I think in a way it would also stigmatize certain communities, correct? Take example of India for that matters, Dalit for that matters, right? So the culture that exists in India in Hinduism, basically that would not give them sense of respect and sense of dignity. And therefore, Ambedkar's argue for, annihilation of, structure itself. So therefore, one would arrive to the conception of individual, conception of community. So conception of community for Ambedkar is to think through the idea of, the collection of individual, and the collection of individual and the collectiveness would, determine through the idea of ethics and morality. It should not, something like, coming from the pre-existence of ethical and moral behavior or moral imperative of, society. Rather, it should, arrive something, for the better of the community. So, so therefore, these are, a few questions that, I wanted to have, and this is the thread of the argument in the book. There are so many other questions that I will skip, but I really enjoy reading. However, there are, moments where it is very difficult to follow because I didn't get any example to, imagine myself and, situate myself to, understand. However, and always, refer to the Western, literature. That is fine in a way, but one need to also give, some example to, to understand to a reader, right? Point one. And the point two is to say that in my discipline of, understanding political philosophy, whether Rawls and many others, basically we, confront with the idea of, the praxis, the idea of empirical, in the sense that, there are so many issues, social, political issues happening around us, and political philosopher would sit and, try to theorize that, in a way respond to them with, example. So the all philosophers that you have cited, whether Mike and Taylor and many others, basically they refers to the political situation in their society and their state. So therefore, this is something very new for me to, an Indian philosopher writing on recognition and in a very, very theoretical and abstract way. So my, only point is to, one need to also give examples so that one would understand the concept in a better way and, engage in a critical way rather, making very hypothetical or, super abstraction. And thank you so much for writing this. I really enjoyed. Hopefully, I'll write something about the book.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Jadumani. Some of the points that I would make actually follow yours, so I'll try to go on to something else. But thank you, Krish, for giving me the opportunity to comment on this very important work, very intensive engagement in a very Western context, has been pointed out. And I would say that, that's both a fair and an unfair critique, because you've made the choices you did about, which authorities or which traditions or which doctrines you want to focus on. But so I had sent Krish a couple of questions by email yesterday evening, just as a little preview. I may ask questions about this, but and I'm not going to ask all of them, believe me. But there's one that I called the big naive question, and it has to do with the whole way that you construct this argument about social embeddedness of different kinds and intersubjectivity, giving direction to political moves, including, what you're calling broadly recognition. So one version of the big naive question is that if mutual recognition is already implicated in our social being and our interactions, as you agree it is, as following Honneth, Broom, Brandom, and Taylor, among others. My question is still, why do so many individuals fail to appreciate the full consequences of our being socially embedded? In other words, they fail to recognize the full consequences of this for rights recognition and, as Jadumani pointed out, respect, dignity, that sort of thing, all of which are important in the political world. So I guess the one persisting difficulty I have in understanding your particular argument is that if this embeddedness is already here, shouldn't we be kind of, to use your term, naturally programmed to cooperate in a much wider range of practices than, say, Adam Smith identifies, the natural propensity to truck and barter and exchange and that sort of thing. Much wider range of practices and interactions in that, and even a much wider range of practices than, say, Marx or Rawls identify. So as I said, maybe adding, since you put in splashes of Foucault and all kinds of other people in trying to explain how power is articulated and internalized and so on, I wondered whether looking at some kind of old-fashioned behaviorists from the 1950s and 60s or conflict theorists, maybe there's still something worth examining in their treatments of why people behave the way they do. I also wonder, again, pointing to something that Jadumani had mentioned, your kind of relentless Western focus. On the one hand, I appreciate the fact that you didn't resort to this cliche that a lot of people refer to now about supposedly African philosophy says, I am because you are. And that's somehow to be an encapsulation of the entire African worldview, whatever that is, as if there's a consolidated African. So I appreciate that. But nevertheless, one might wonder why we look at it in terms of, kind of an essential or essentialized Western or an essentialized non-Western understanding of both the political and what might be called the natural or the pre-political. At what point you do refer to Talal Asad talking about Western style secularism, and the way you paraphrase him is that Western style secularism, whether it's somehow inherent in Western thought from, I don't know, Aristotle, or whether it comes up with Protestantism or whatever, take your pick, Western-style secularism views humans as sovereign, self-owning agents, essentially suspicious of others, not merely subjects conscious of their own identities. Now, you could say this is maybe a kind of Occidentalism, right, an oversimplification of Western traditions, but still I think it's worth considering whether, because this goes right to the heart of recognition and also touches upon, kind of facts of conflict, why social and political conflict happen. So I have to admit, I find your total explanation still a little bit not quite satisfying in terms of explaining how this, what you call natural social embeddedness, kind of primes us or prepares us for a kind of engagement with each other as political agents. One other point is that although in the first chapters you make this distinction, you come in on the side of what you call the anti-essentialists, and then you set up a group of essentialists, including Kant and Rawls, and then you put Hegel and others on the other side as anti-essentialists. But yeah, so I wonder whether you're still maybe preserving or perpetuating another kind of essentialism about contracts and contractual thinking and behaving as if some social contract or compact exists. You do refer to, continually to both Kant's idea of kind of situational ethics and Hegel's system of ethical life, again, as being essentially pre-political, or something that goes into civil society and then the state somehow systematizes this and then we have the state. One could argue that's still falling back in the same social contract way of thinking, right? There's the pre-political and then there's the political. And the whole thrust of your argument is that we should already be kind of primed to behave in a certain way because of our pre-political commitments. And of course, I mean, this isn't an original point at all, but one could still ask, how are those pre-political? If you have this very kind of stripped down Hobbesian or Lockean notion of there's an act of contract or some single moment, which of course people as far removed as Bentham and Green rubbished and so on as not being historically plausible and so on. But still this I wonder whether you're perpetuating this dichotomy of the political and the pre-political. And finally, the last point here, the term natural nature, terms natural nature, naturalizing come in, and you talk about natural embeddedness, and clearly you don't mean some broad sense of kind of planetary coexistence, or maybe you do, or being in a quote unquote natural environment. But you use the terms in kind of a dichotomy or in pairs, the social and the natural. Sometimes it seems to me that when you say natural, you actually mean social, if one can understand social again in that contractual way as being pre-political. So I just will be interested to see how you develop that or work that out. I said that's my last point, so that will be. I have several other things to ask you, but I won't bother you with those today. But thank you again for a very rich book and a very substantive engagement with a lot of important thinkers in the so-called Western tradition who certainly have a lot to say about historical and present political dilemmas and how we get around them. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your very incisive questions and comments. And maybe I'll take it by turn. I will first talk about how I understood Jadumani's questions, and I will try and present some kind of a defense, and if a defense is possible. Now, I think, from what I understand, Jadumani comes, or rather he's critiquing my idea of social norms, partly because politically and historically social norms have tended to create divisions which are unfair. And I think historical societies, and we all know that traditions and histories in different cultures, and it seems a fact of history that, or rather a consequence of historical societies, that there is some kind of injustice that is meted out to one set of people or the other. So, I mean, his question, as I understand it, is, by talking about social norms, am I not kind of either presupposing or agreeing to the fact that there are such kind of injustices? And he seems to argue that if I have an idea of social norms, how do I get away from within the social norm, paradigm, these kinds of historical injustices and so on and so forth, which is a very fair argument. But I want to say that social norms, so that's why I critique in my book. So there are different forms of social norms, and I think as we have historically mediated our relationships, social relationships, through different kinds of institutions, whether it may be a nation or whether it is, I don't know, religion or so on and so forth. So there have been different kinds of social mediations, and all these different mediations I critique, or I say problematic, for the fact that the further removed you are from the actual social and fluid social engagements that people are in, the further removed you are from that, then the higher is the chance of creating those kinds of structural injustices that you talk about. So in some ways, I'm trying to say that you can salvage a social framework of norms if we keep close, so to speak, to social behavior and not necessarily build on it to some kind of an abstract institution. Or the further, I mean, it all depends on where you are on the scale. The further removed you are from the dynamic nature of social norms that we engage with on a daily basis. And by social norms, I mean the basic set of commitments that all of us have to be able to act and react in different ways. And I think that's, I take it as a given that daily cooperation and daily interaction and communication happen because we're able to ascribe different kinds of statuses to different kinds of people. You ascribe a status from an epistemic perspective, you ascribe epistemic statuses, but from a social perspective, you ascribe different kinds of statuses to different people. You think of this person as X and that person as Y. And so that's a commitment, that's a certain description of a particular commitment. Whether that person really fulfills that description or not is a separate question. But I argue that this kind of description of commitments, and which come with its own entitlements and so on, is a necessary element of how we socially function. And so, and the second aspect of it is that it keeps changing, so that the same two people who interact in one context and ascribe to each other a set of statuses, normative statuses, might, in a different context, have a different set of statuses. And so that's something that sometimes in institutional structures is, for different reasons, missed out. So a point I'm trying to make is it's possible to have a social framework of norms and help sustain a society which is not unjust. And the second point, I mean, the other point he made was about Indian philosophy, and we had a conversation about this before, and he said that then as well, and even now, and I say the same thing. I stand guilty, and so for whatever reason, and I need a psychoanalyst view of why I do this, but I have done this. So, but maybe in the future I will, incorporate some of these things. And if you say Ambedkar has said some of the things I've already said, then that's all the more reason for me to go to him, because he has said it. So yeah. No, and he, the other critique, which is related to the first point he was making, which is that, you can't, there is a problem, and which he pointed out rightly, that with social norms as kind of grounding how people ought to behave with each other, there's a kind of relativism that might creep in, right? And I think you are talking about how there needs to be some kind of agency or some kind of a individual who stands as a reason against relativism, in the sense that it can't be that if a society says X, Y, Z, the individual has to do it, which is a very valid point. But I want to say that the inviolability of an individual, which you seem to stress, does not necessarily have to come with a lot of metaphysical assumptions of what an agent is, an individual, which is what I question. I don't necessarily question the reason for the inviolability of agency, which I agree, but I think that the inviolability of agency comes not because of the fact that he's an individual or other kinds of psychological or metaphysical assumptions that you might have, but it comes from, it can come from within the social network, social norms framework, because I think, and this is something I point out very briefly, the very fact that an individual can sorry for this formulation, can recognize his misrecognition, in some sense, at least points to the fact that there is an ultimate arbiter who is the individual who can decide what kind of social norms needs to go and what needs to come in. So the fact that an individual can, from a personal perspective, experience misrecognition is something that cannot be translated into a set of rules, and two, it's something that's very personal. It preserves the sense of inviolability that you're talking about, but does not necessarily force me to therefore accept all the other, what I think are questionable assumptions within the individualistic model, if you want to call it, which talks about individual as being, somehow an agent who is inviolate and so on and so forth. So that's so, and the idea of misrecognition, I don't talk about it briefly, I don't talk about it much, and I wish I did. Maybe something that for me to think about, the idea that misrecognition can, can fit into this whole network. And another point he made was, well, it all looks very communitarian, right? What's the whole thing about this recognition model if we're just going the communitarian way? But I want to say very briefly why it's not communitarian. I think two problems I have with communitarianism, among many, though there are some overlapping assumptions that I work with from communitarian, is that I think I'm not able to find in any communitarian literature I've read any kind of normative model. So they have a lot of good way in which they talk about tradition and how tradition is you're embedded in a tradition and culture and so on, but they're not able to tell me what kind of standard I can use to evaluate one and the other. And so there's this very relativistic, which I have problems with. So that's one big problem I have. And nor are they able to either historically or argumentatively explain, as far as I understand, how changes in cultures and norms happen. So they have these different set of cultures, East, West, or within the West, or within the East, you can have different kinds of cultures. How does historical change happen from one to the other? They have a merely, if at all they have an account, they have a merely descriptive account, but then I think there is more to it than just saying that there's a change that has happened. I can't find in the communitarian model a more substantive account how changes happen. Other thing is, he was talking about my post-colonial critique of post-colonial society. I just want to put it in context. The critique of post-colonial society is in continuity with my other critiques of other institutions and other institutional frameworks. I critique nationalism as a quote-unquote ideology, and I critique post-colonial theory as a theory. And so I critique all these different kinds of theories of institutions, if you will. And then post-colonial theory comes in that perspective. And then he was asking me why, we don't seem to talk about other kinds of post-colonial critique, which like Gandhi and so on and so forth. I didn't talk about it in this, but I have written a couple of chapters on Gandhi as a critique of, in some other work. And so I think he has a good critique going. A lot of things which I don't agree with and questionable in what he says, but there are a couple of points which I agree with. Anyway, that's something we can talk about later. Yeah, and the other point, which is related to the earlier point, is communities have a tendency to stigmatize people, but do communities? Yeah, so I agree that communities stigmatize, and it has been a historical fact that different communities have stigmatized. But I don't think that is necessarily an element of how communities ought to work. And I think you can have a conception of a society or a practice of a society which, if I am right, if it can incorporate the natural social commitments that we have, can, I think, get away from stigmatizing. Because if it is, so to speak, listening to the different peoples and their experience of misrecognition and so on and so forth, it is possible to have, so my point is, it's not necessary that if you have a community, there has to be stigmatization. I think you can have an idea of community without stigma, and that's what I'm trying to do as well. And the other one is find examples. Yeah, that's a good point. I will next time. I think maybe I will use more, even at the risk of making it fat and so on. Yeah. So. Yeah. So let me quickly address Dennis's point, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I think I'm going to take up here what I think was a very significant point, which is contractual thinking. I seem to be committed to some kind of contractual thinking in my view. So am I really arguing against contract theory is, I think, your point. But I think I would say yes, I am committed, but that does not necessarily make me committed to everything that the contractual theory says. What the aspect of contract, very loosely, that I'm committed to is the idea of commitments. And I think without some kind of commitments, you cannot have normative behavior, because to be able to commit to something and to be able to aware that you're committed to something is a necessary element of what we can call intentional or normative behavior. And I think that is quite a natural and self-evident aspect of our social existence. The other point you were talking about is the first point, which is, he says that mutual recognition is already implicated. Then what's the whole point of this? Where does it get us? And I think so his point is mutual recognition. If it's already implicated, then why are not people realizing it, right? So what I'm trying to say is mutual recognition, one, is implicit. So it's possible that people may not recognize that they are implicated in a relationship of recognition, because it can be implicit and therefore they don't have explicit recognition of it.
Recognizing that they're recognizing.
Yeah. And the second point is that just because recognition is happening and two people are explicitly recognizing does not necessarily mean that it translates to the right kind of recognition. So it's possible for two people to recognize each other, but still not be fair to each other. And so, so there's a different story we need, or there's a different source we need to go to, which will kind of distinguish us between recognition, the right kind of recognition and the wrong kind of recognition. And that's why, though we naturally recognize each other, we still need a normative account how we ought to recognize each other. So that's why I say, we need both the natural and the normative, and that's why I say it's, it's a natural account of normativity. So I'm just going to maybe stop here and then open it up for questions, and then I can come back to a couple of points you made, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm going to dive into deep because thank you. I just trying to flip through and look forward to the opportunity of actually reading it, perhaps writing a review as well, maybe for Sophia or some. But I think Jadumani and Dennis probably will do a better job of that. And but yeah, that's one of the first questions I put here. But you both addressed that. So recognition is a transitive verb, so a transitive word, sort of recognition of what and whom and so on. Yeah. But of course, it's a recognition of the other, and perhaps more in a Lebanesian sense, maybe, in the face of the other. So I wonder if we, so kind of an old term that's being brought back, perhaps there is kind of a more recent kind of ways in which people are talking about the other, and in the ethical context as well, which is you probably engage with that, I'm sure you do. But perhaps a more substantive point, in a lot of sort of political theory and political philosophy that goes on these days, there is always this sort of suspicion that perhaps we're sort of revisiting a neo-Kantian kind of individualism, right? I mean, that could be said of, Habermas, Rorty, and a whole lot of people, Rawls, of course, much more, I guess, than anyone else. And there's a bit of smattering of Hegelian, Marxian, communitarianism thrown in, particularly in Habermas, sort of kind of hides his neo-Kantianness very well with the kind of neo-Marxian sort of veneer, but it sort of shows through in his sort of dialogues and discussions with Rawls. I wonder if we're sort of not being able to get away from that. That's sort of one issue. The other is naturalizing. This sort of process has been going on for some time. I think, from Aristotle, perhaps, naturalizing Plato, and then all through some medievalist Spinoza, doing that with Judeo-Christianity, with his ethics, and Comte, and, Auguste Comte, and I'm thinking of Weber as well, with the disenchantment, so sort of the secularization, rather. I wonder in what other sense are we going about naturalizing, of course, the whole Hobbesian million and so forth too, but also in epistemology, as we all know, the whole naturalizing movement that sort of, goes on with David Lewis and people like that. It kind of gets unstuck somewhere at some point, because what is it? I mean, you're pitting yourself against what when you're naturalizing, right? Which is the excessive spiritual religiousness of medieval times, or is it kind of the transcendentalism of perhaps even phenomenologists and so forth? So that is something that perhaps I'm sure you deal with, but it just sort of kind of occurred to me as we're going through. Finally, Jadumani sort of raised that question, and you addressed that of the Indian context as well, since we are kind of having to deal with, not just because historically, but the challenges that we have. Are we going to deal with the minority questions, the LGBTQ, gender, all kinds of stuff that's going on? I mean, are there ramifications? Will we be able to apply this? But there has been this from the time of Arthashastra and the Dharmashastras, a whole lot of political material. Chandragupta, Ashoka, when they set up their empires and so forth, there's a fair bit of kind of naturalization going on in there as well. Of course, Buddhist, Hindu in some sense, but but not so much in the political context. I mean, I think they're much more conscious. But in perhaps more recent times, early 20th century sort of liberals, including, Sarojini Naidu, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Sapru, I mean, Waka, there's the Nehrus were sort of really geared towards kind of naturalizing political norms, if you like, in that sense. And of course, it echoes in Ambedkar and Gandhi to an extent also. So, but finally, there's a term that's in Abhinav Gupta, as a pratyabhijna, recognition. It's a very, 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 very important, and it's been used in aesthetics, sort of alongside Kant's critique, if you like. But also, there's some work. There was Ramu Gandhi who did a bit of that in his work of you are, therefore I am. You could turn it around the other way, sort of Bubas, you and I, yes, sort of rather than I and thou. Yes, I mean, that was sort of based on the sort of kind of idea of recognizing the other as oneself, or the Lebanesian sense, I exist in the face of the other. So, perhaps interesting discussions to have. Yeah,
as far as Levinas, and I critique, though.
Sorry, Levinas, I critique because I think for Levinas, there are two moves that he makes, which is that the relationship between oneself and the other is an ethical one and not a political one. And so for him, the other exists at some level beyond the possibility, and he says the face of the other and so on, beyond the possibility of conceptualizing in any way the other. But I think, and I have a section on it in my book, but I think in my story, the recognition of the other in terms of cooperating with the other necessarily involves a certain conceptual understanding of the other. And so, in some sense, it goes against Levinas, because Levinas says the other is, is the absolute other, and so on, which I don't think is possible in my story. The second point you made about Kant, and yes, I've been very fascinated by Kantian and neo-Kantian retelling of the old story, and I at some point I was also thinking of incorporating a lot of neo-Kantian constructivists, for example, Christine Korsgaard and so on, who talk about Kantian rules as constructions, a constructivist account. But I disagree with it because it doesn't quite give me a kind of moral realism that I want if it's constructive, and I'm not quite able to square how constructivism and moral realism can coexist. As for and again, there are Kantians and Kantians, and so and I didn't want to get into it because there are so many Kantians, and there's also the other Kantians who always tell me this is not what Kant said. So in some sense, they're always going back to what Kant said in his book, and said those are the Kant scholars who are who are a very difficult bunch. Whatever I say, they said no, this is not what Kant said. So anyway. Indian context. So let me talk about naturalizing. Naturalizing, as you rightly point out, is a tradition in epistemology, in phenomenology. In some, I want to distinguish mine from theirs in two ways. One, mine is a social account, so it's not in any way a physical naturalizing. The second is, I don't know about theirs, but mine doesn't presuppose any kind of reductionism or eliminativism, or for me, norms are natural in the sense that norms exist. I don't know if they exist as a natural kind. Maybe they do, I haven't thought about it. But they do exist in our social behavior, which we can read from how people interact with each other. So in some sense, the idea, which is opposed to a lot of others like, say, Hobbes and others, who say that we are naturally non-cooperative, naturally violent, and therefore, for us to be able to cooperate with each other, we need some kind of a normative framework which is either imposed or you consent to or whatever it is. But I think that I oppose, and I say that it is something that you can read from how people interact. So that's what I meant by naturalizing. And in terms of, in the Indian context, I agree, and I'm now reading up on, as I think we had a conversation, I'm reading up on Indian philosophy and trying to find different interlocutors to be able to, including the peoples you mentioned. So yeah, I hope to in the future, I don't know how long it will take, but in the future to incorporate some of these points. Thank you.
Reading the book in manuscript and debating something with you, but I can't remember what we talked about, whether you incorporate anything. But my question is a question of kind of comment. I find it very interesting when a philosophical discourse comes into contact with other kinds of discourses. And two or three things immediately occurred to me. One of those was the reality of identity politics as it exists in the real world. And where do you create a conversation between the kind of issues you're talking about in the book and those kind of empirical realities? Perhaps this was also the point you were making about the actual political reality. I mean, the second thing was, just in class this morning, I was talking with students about, just a class in sociology of art, we were talking about not recognition, but representation. And the interesting question of, indeed, identity as defined by others, and the way in which that identity will be depicted, particularly in that context, in visual art, in visuality. And whether again, there is some kind of interesting dialogue going on potentially between this idea of recognition as what I would always understand it as a kind of outward-going thing, maybe in post-colonial context or something, I want to be recognized as politically or as a minority or whatever, and the way in which people themselves are recognized by forces outside themselves, and where you find any kind of dialogue, discussion or something, between, and a kind of inner and outer dimension to this possibly, and can that in fact be incorporated into the way in which you presented the idea of recognition?
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. In some way, that is, though I don't formulate it in that way, is the main problematic of my book, is why we are caught between two poles of a conceptual swing or whatever. On the one hand, you have self-representation, and the other you have representation by the others, and therefore it seems to me from my reading that there is no way one can resolve this tension between how to constitute identity. On the one hand, you have in modern forms of political representation the primacy of the self-representing capacity, in the sense I take myself to be X, Y, Z, and that is somehow the final statement you can make about identity. But on the other hand, you also have different institutions which give you certain identities, which are something that you carry all your life. So both are equal aspects of your identity, in the sense that there is an irreducible aspect to your self-identity, in such that you identify yourself as X, Y, Z, you can, and that can be the arbiter of who you are. But at the same time, you have the social and political aspect of identity, which is what you are as citizen or whatever for social political purposes. But I think this tension in itself is problematic, in the sense that whether you go to some kind of whether you subject your identity to some kind of incorrigible experience of yourself, or whether you reduce it to what the institution gives you, is both problematic, and I think my account of recognition is a kind of a bridge which can acknowledge both without necessarily giving one or the other primacy. And I think this problem of, what constitutes identity or is in my account at least, the notion of recognition is able to deny to both the institutional structures of identity as well as the personal, incorrigible, ineffable idea of identity, a sense of normative validation, and that's what we're looking for. And I think there is, I think I disagree when either of the camps say that this is the ultimate, standard of normative validation, and I think we need both. And I think the idea of recognition is cognitive, so therefore it incorporates the personal aspect as well, and it's socio-political, and therefore it incorporates the social perspectives of identity formation. So I think it's a good bridge.
Read the book, or so unfortunately, and maybe you've included some of these. Number one, why did you write the book? That's my question. And secondly, I would question also, do you touch upon, let's see, the fundamentals of religion within the creation of identities? Because everyone you've mentioned is, whether it's Western or, as Jadumani mentioned, the, underpinning of what goes on in India. It has, I'm using the word religious in the broadest sense of the term. And then thirdly, gender. I think, the question of gender in questions of identity, of self-identity, of othering people has an enormous amount to do with the question.
I'll be able to adequately answer these questions. I can answer the first question maybe adequately, and then I'll go to the second question. Why did I write the book? Now, I've been thinking about some of these issues, and the question of, and I think as all of us are, we are moved by socio-political events, but, and I thought, to go back to the earlier point I was making, we seem to have reached a deadlock when it comes to intelligible discussion on identity and so on. Then either you have very subjective ideas or very objective ideas, in the sense of very socially instituted ideas or very subjective ideas of gender and so on, so forth, so forth. But I thought both of them are problematic because it doesn't quite help have an intelligent discussion about moral issues, because it can't just be structural, nor can it be just personal, because that's, in a way, getting away from the discussion of what kind of moral imperatives that we need to deal with. You can't say a moral is right just because I'm saying it, and you can't say it's right just because the structure has instituted it. So in that was very uncomfortable for me, and I think that's a feature of modernity or modern ways of political formation, and I was very uncomfortable, and I was thinking about ways of saying something intelligent about it. And then I kept reading here and there, and then suddenly when I was, suddenly something clicked, and I was like, okay, maybe I can tell a story about this which is at least partly coherent. So that's why I wrote it. The second aspect of identity, religion. Now, religion is an important aspect, which I don't touch upon in any way that is specific. So I've kind of, the advantage of doing philosophy, if at all, is you can move in a very abstract realm. So you can be taken to mean different things. So I haven't talked about religion, and I think now I'm thinking about religion after this. as a phenomenon, as an experience, or as an idea. Now, maybe in the future, I want to talk about religion. I've not done so here as much. So yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Just a clarification. I don't think. So, in response to me and also in this response to you, you just seem to be sort of predicating recognition on the conceptual, because you mentioned cognitive a few times, right? So the problem, one of the issues with conceptual might be that, you're kind of constructing the other in your concept, right? Because concepts can only go so far, right? Or if you take Kant, I mean, the categories, they're already built into me. So how am I actually reaching the other? So this is an issue of any kind of conceptual. I know I'm trying to conceptualize Mr. O.P. Jindal there. There's absolutely no contact with him whatsoever. It's entirely in my head. However, and in your critique of Levinas was that it's not conceptual. Well, it's precisely the point, though. A whole lot of phenomenology, maybe if you go back to Heidegger as well, right, the Sorg and so forth, it's based on care, it's based on empathy, it's based on feeling. One reaches out the other, I am thou. It's not conceptual, it's actually, the heart going up. A whole lot of feminists would say that as well.
No, you have a good point. So, I didn't finish I do talk about the non-conceptual as grounded, I don't talk about it enough, in one's ability to misrecognize when one is under any form of injustice. The fact that you can immediately, experientially recognize misrecognition, right? When something unjust happens to me, I am angered or frustrated. I'm not able to conceptualize what it is that happened to me, but the very fact, so in some sense, I have an account of the non-conceptual, which is, for me, partly constituted by my immediate reaction or the recognition of misrecognition, which is non-conceptual. So that will help me, if I'm able to misrecognize, or rather, if I'm able to recognize an act of misrecognition, that is immediate for me, and thereby I can project that onto you. And when you say you have been dealt badly by somebody, I can sympathize, and that's a grounding for my sympathy. So anyway, I have a... It's not default, right? It's not about misrecognition. The recognition itself. Yeah. Yeah, I know, yeah, but, okay, but I think... No, you can't have a theory of, no, that's why you need recognition to have the theory of justice, but to know that there has been injustice that has happened, you need to be able to feel it or know it or, yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, congratulations on your book release, and thank you for this talk. Much like others, I have to add the caveat that I have not read the book yet, so I think a lot of my questions may be premature, but I would request you to entertain me on these points. So I think a number of points have been addressed by Professor Bilamoria's questions and how concepts have come up. That's one thing. So I have many questions, but because of the paucity of time, I will limit them to some central curiosity, if you will. So the first point being, yeah, sure, there has been a naturalizing turn in philosophy in a lot of philosophical domains so far. So, but if you trace a specific genealogy of naturalism, of course, you talk about a very kind of naturalizing social in the social realm. But if you trace a genealogy of naturalizing, there's two specific strands that you can pull out. There's ontological naturalism, which is what I intuitively suppose that I think you are endorsing, and then there is methodological naturalism, right? But then I want to ask, what is your commitment to methodological naturalism? Because to me, once again, intuitively, it seems that you can't make much sense of political norms per se without by in some sense eliminating the supernatural, right? This maybe relates to a question on the role of religion, right? So that's my first question. The second question being, you critique a Hobbesian state of nature, so to speak. So when Hobbes talks about, before there was law, right? So, but in that, I think you use a very specific phraseology, natural social embeddedness, but in this realm, there's been a lot of interesting work in quantum theory, sort of to invoke something a little random here, but the idea that human cognition, human embodied cognition, specifically social embodied cognition, although that point may be refuted, lies entirely outside the non-locality bound. It is outside space and time. So to me, two things stand out here. Actually, no, it is one thing. So concepts, like have been stated before, presuppose the existence of something, right? You're presupposing the existence of political norms. But in some sense, would it be fair to invoke a minimal metaphysical principle here that, regardless of space and time where you are, what time you're in, there are some construction of some political norms, specifically political norms, and that these, as opposed to having formal normativity, have full-blooded normativity. So I make a case here that, okay, the moral, the political, controversially the political, the moral, the political, the social, are all parts of basic epistemic domains, right? So, but to get at those basic epistemic domains, the political might arguably be a non-basic domain, but the fact that, facts in non-basic domains obtain in virtue of facts in basic domains, right? So the basic domain here being, once again, the point that I'm perhaps talking about, the minimal metaphysical presupposition of political norms in this sense. So what would you have to say about this?
Okay, thank you for that question. I will try and maybe, there were a lot of things going on there, so I don't know if I will be able to answer all your questions. And again, given the interest of time, and we can always talk over your points in the break. If you think, are you talking about some kind of metaphysical in terms of religious experience? Is that what you're talking about, or? Huh? But yeah, do we need transcendental presuppositions? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
At some point,
Yeah.
But then you're construing concepts, in this case, political norms, naturalizing political norms to get at the nature or something. That, in some sense, you're presupposing that there is something.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I get it. But I'm kind of non-committal to it, but I will give you my unconsidered opinion, and which is that I think there is. I do believe in some kind of moral realism, in the sense that there are these political norms that exist, whether they are metaphysical or whatever. I don't know, but I'm kind of tempted towards believing that there is. Hey, Catherine. So there is, I do think so, yeah.
Right. And in connection with Professor Lighton's remarks, I think one interesting thing to see here would be contract theory, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, you refute contract theory, is if I construed you right. But what would you think about, I would, once again, intuitively, my sense would be, it's not quite, I don't think contract theory even kicks in this domain. I think the word I would use is quasi-contractual realism, right? When you're talking about something like, but then again, that sort of presupposes a Hobbesian understanding because, you're saying, before contracts really came along, right? But before contractual theory really came along. But again, intuitively, I would think that quasi-contractual realism has more to say in this sort of domain than contract theory per se, in the sense that, it's arising epiphenomenally, right? So what would you have to say about that?
There's a lot of things going on there. We've talked about epiphenomenalism. I can talk for hours, but I suppose they're all waiting to take class and so on. So let's talk. Okay, thank you.